The forecast called it the worst storm to hit the Alleghenies in 30 years. By the time it reached Corliss, Pennsylvania, the temperature had dropped to 19 below, and the wind dragged it lower than that. Roads closed. Power went out across the whole valley. And on a short, forgotten street called Chestnut Row, a 74-year-old woman named Eula Grant heard someone pounding on her front door. She opened it. 4 men stood on her porch. Leather vests, snow packed into their beards and frozen onto their jackets. Hell's Angels colors stitched across their backs. One of them was hurt. He held his arm against his chest, and blood had soaked dark through the sleeve. Most people in that town would have kept the chain on the door and reached for the phone. Eula Grant stepped back and told them to come in before the cold killed them. She had no idea that the oldest man in that group, the one with the gray in his beard and the quiet way about him, was worth more money than every house on Chestnut Row put together. And what he did the next morning, once the sun came up over all that snow, is the part nobody in Corliss saw coming. She didn't even pause. That's the thing that stays with me. She looked at 4 strangers who had every reason to scare her, and she just opened the door wider. Hold on to that, because we'll get back to it. But before that night, you need to know who Eula Grant was. You need to understand why she had every reason in the world to leave that door shut, and why she opened it anyway. Corliss sits in a fold of the mountains in the western part of Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half from Pittsburgh if the roads are clear. It used to be a coke town. Rows of ovens burned day and night back when Eula was a girl, turning coal into coke for the steel mills downriver. The sky over Corliss glowed orange at night, and the men came home black to the elbows, and there was work for anybody who wanted it. Full church pews on Sunday, kids everywhere, a main street with a 5 and dime, a picture house, 2 diners, and a hardware store that had been in the same family for 60 years. Then the ovens went cold. The mills bought their coke somewhere cheaper, and one by one, the reasons to live in Corliss dried up and blew away. People moved to the cities or down south where the jobs were. The picture house boarded up. The 5 and dime closed. By the time this story happens, Corliss had lost more than half the people it once had. The main street was mostly plywood over broken glass, and folks drove through it on their way to somewhere better. Right at the end of a dead street called Chestnut Row, in a narrow clapboard house with a sagging front porch, lived Eula Grant, 74 years old, a retired seamstress, a widow. Her husband, Walter, had passed 9 years back. Everybody called him Walt. He worked the coke ovens as a young man, and then the rail yard when the ovens shut down, and by the end, his lungs were finished. Black lung, the doctor said, though the company found ways to call it something else so they wouldn't have to pay. Walt spent his last 2 winters dragging an oxygen tank behind him from the kitchen to the front room and back. Eula sat with him through all of it. The night he died, she held his hand in that little back bedroom and promised him she'd be all right on her own. She had mostly kept that promise. Mostly. Eula lived alone in the same house Walt bought for them in 1974, the year they married. He built the back porch himself out of lumber he hauled home 1 board at a time from the yard. He built it crooked, honestly. The floor slopes a little toward the yard, but Eula never let anyone fix it. She said the slope was where Walt's hands had been, and she wanted his hands to stay right where they were. Every morning Eula was up before 6, not because she had anywhere to be, but because that was how she was built. She'd put the kettle on and feed the old dog who had wandered up onto her porch 4 winters ago and never left. She named him Biscuit. He was some kind of hound mix, gray around the muzzle now, mostly deaf, and he followed her from room to room like a shadow. After she fed him, she would sit at the kitchen table with her Bible and her tea, and she would tell Walt whatever was on her mind, because his photograph was still on the shelf above the stove where she could see it. Now, here is what Eula's life actually looked like, because it matters for everything that comes after. She lived on a small pension check and her Social Security. It came to a little over $1,100 a month, and out of that came the taxes, the light bill, the medicine, and the coal for the little stove that heated the front of the house. There was never anything left over. Her roof had been failing for 2 years. When it rained, she set out an old canner pot and a bucket in the spare room to catch what came through, and she emptied them onto the flowers so the water wouldn't go to waste. The furnace had quit the winter before last, and there was no money to replace it, so she heated the house with a coal stove and closed off the back rooms with a blanket nailed over the doorway. The county had sent her a letter in the fall about back taxes, $680 behind, with more piling on. She put the letter in the drawer with the electric bill she was carrying over and the pharmacy statement, and she didn't look in that drawer if she could help it, because looking made her stomach hurt. The steps up to her front porch had gone soft with rot. She'd fallen on them in October, caught herself on the rail, and bruised her hip so bad she couldn't sleep on that side for a month. She never told a soul. She just started going down them sideways, one hand on the post, testing each board before she trusted it. But you will not find a single person in Corliss who ever heard Eula Grant complain. Not her neighbor Ruth across the fence. Not the bakers 2 doors down. Not the boy who delivered her medicine from the pharmacy. It was not that she was hiding it out of pride, though maybe there was some of that. It was more that she had a rule she lived by, and the rule was simple. You take what you've been given, and while you're getting by on it, you find some way to help the next person along. That was her whole religion, really. More than church, which she couldn't get to anymore, since it closed and folded into a bigger, 1-2 towns over that she had no way to reach in winter. She mended clothes for half the street and wouldn't take a dime for it. If a child's coat came apart at the seam, or a man tore his only good pair of work pants, they knew to bring it to Eula, and it came back stitched so clean you couldn't find the tear. She took in the Delgado kids after school 3 days a week while their mother worked a double at the nursing home, and she fed them and helped them with their reading and never once asked to be paid. On Sundays, she cooked more than one old woman could eat, and she carried covered plates to whoever on Chestnut Row was having a hard month. She didn't knock. She left the plate on the porch and walked home so nobody would feel they owed her a thank you. She told the Delgado kids one afternoon, while they sat at her table eating cornbread with butter, that you don't need much to give a lot. She believed it all the way down. The town council didn't know her name. The county saw her as a tax number in a drawer. The world had every chance to make Eula Grant hard, and it never quite managed it. Now, the afternoon the storm came in, the sky over Corliss turned the color of a bruise by 3 o'clock. Snow started an hour later, fast and heavy, the kind that stacks up faster than you'd believe. The radio said the interstate was closing, and the county was under a blizzard warning through the night, with wind chills falling past 20 below. Eula moved through the house, getting ready the way her mother had taught her. She filled every pot she owned with water, in case the pipes froze. She checked the coal bucket and carried up an extra scuttle from the cellar. She stacked spare quilts on the arm of the couch. And then she did something she couldn't explain, not even to herself. She went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, the one she rarely opened, and she took out Walt's heavy wool coat, dark green, canvas over wool, worn soft at the cuffs. It still carried the smell of him after all these years, coal smoke and pipe tobacco, and something underneath that was just Walt. She carried it out to the front room and laid it across the back of the couch. In case somebody needs it, she said out loud, to nobody, to Biscuit, to the photograph over the stove. She had no idea why she said it. By morning, she would. By 7 o'clock, Corliss had vanished under the snow. You couldn't see the house across the street. The wind screamed through the wires, and every so often you'd hear a crack somewhere out in the dark as a limb gave way under the ice. Then the power went. The whole valley dropped into black all at once, and Chestnut Row went silent. Eula lit 2 oil lamps. She set one in the kitchen window because that was where Walt used to watch for her when she was out late, and she set the other on the shelf beside his photograph. She fed the stove and pulled her quilt around her shoulders and sat in Walt's old chair with Biscuit's head heavy on her feet, and she listened to the house groan against the wind, and she settled in for a long, cold night. 5 miles north of her, out on the mountain road, 4 men were in serious trouble. They were riders out of a chapter up near Erie, 4 men on 4 machines, and they were on the road that weekend because of a promise. A year before, one of their brothers had died. His name was Hank Mercer. He'd ridden with them for the better part of 20 years, and he'd gone down on a wet curve on a summer night, coming home from a wedding, and that was that. Every year on the weekend closest to the day he passed, the chapter made the run he loved best, the long way through the mountains, because it was the road Hank always said made him feel like the world was still big. They rode it for him. It was the one thing they did that nobody joked about. The man leading them was 58 years old, big through the shoulders, gray coming into a dark beard, a way of holding still that made younger men quiet down when he walked into a room. The others called him Marcus. Behind him rode a wiry older man named Roscoe, a heavy-set one named Dell, and the youngest of them, a kid barely into his 20s named Toby. The storm was faster than the forecast. The snow was supposed to hold off until after midnight, but by 6:30 the road ahead had already disappeared, and the asphalt underneath had turned to a sheet of ice you couldn't see. Marcus went down first. His front tire slid out from under him on a long curve, and 800 pounds of steel went sideways and put him down hard on his hip and shoulder. He got up slow. Behind him, Toby swerved to miss him and dumped his own bike, and the kid came off it wrong and caught the edge of a guardrail bolt across his forearm. It opened him up from the wrist nearly to the elbow, and the blood came fast and dark, and by the time he got to his feet, his hand had already gone half numb. 2 of the machines wouldn't start again. The cold had flooded them, and the batteries were dying, and there was no shelter anywhere, and no cell signal because the towers were down under the ice. Marcus checked the map on a dead phone before the last of the light went out of it and saw one town close by, Corliss, a little under 5 miles south. He made the call the way he made all of them, quiet and final. They would walk, push what they could, leave the rest, and get out of the wind before it took them. So they laid the 2 dead bikes down in a drift on the shoulder and started south into the teeth of it, 4 men in leather and boots, walking into a blizzard in the pitch dark. Cold like that does not give you long. Exposed skin starts to go in half an hour, less if you're wet. And they were all wet, and Toby was bleeding, and the wind cut through leather like it was cheesecloth. Marcus put the kid in the middle and kept the older 2 moving and walked at the front himself, and every few minutes he turned around and counted heads out loud. "Nobody sits down," he told them. "You sit down out here, you don't get up." It took them close to 2 hours to reach the edge of Corliss. When they finally came off the mountain onto the first flat street, every window they passed was dark and every door was shut. They knocked on the first house they came to. Nothing. They knocked on the second, and a curtain twitched, and then it went still, and no light came on. Toby was shaking so hard by then, he couldn't work his own fingers. Dell's feet had stopped hurting, which is the sign you don't want. They were running out of time, and they knew it. Then Marcus saw it. Down at the end of the last street, past a row of black houses, one small light burned steady in a window. Just one. A lamp behind glass, warm and yellow against all that white. Eula's house. He turned the others toward it and made himself climb the soft, rotten steps, and he raised a fist that he could barely feel and knocked 3 times on the door. Inside, Eula heard it over the wind, and she went still. Biscuit lifted his head. She set down her cup, took the lamp, and went to the door slow, because 74-year-old knees don't hurry. She put her hand on the knob and stood there a second, and then she opened it. 4 enormous men filled up her whole porch. Leather and beards and snow, and the colors on their backs that everyone in a town like Corliss had heard stories about. The young one was bleeding through his sleeve and swaying on his feet. 4 hard-looking strangers on an old widow's doorstep in the black middle of a killing night. Everything the world had ever told Eula Grant to be afraid of was standing right there on her porch. Marcus's voice came out low and cracked from the cold. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to trouble you. We got caught out in the storm, and one of my boys is hurt bad. We just need to get out of the wind." The wind howled up the steps behind them. Eula looked at his face a long moment. She looked past him at the bleeding kid. She looked back at the old man. Then she pulled the door wide. "Well, get in here," she said, "before the 4 of you freeze to death on my porch." What happened inside that house over the next several hours is where this whole story really turns. The men filed in one at a time and filled her little front room wall to wall. They had to duck under the door frame. Snow slid off their shoulders and melted in gray puddles on the floorboards, and the whole room went thick with the smell of wet leather and frozen road. Biscuit thumped his tail against the floor, too old and too deaf to be much of a guard dog, and let them be. Eula didn't so much as flinch. She looked at those 4 men the way she looked at a torn coat somebody handed her over the fence, like a job she had already decided to do. "Sit down wherever there's room," she said, "and somebody bring that boy to my kitchen where the light is." They walked Toby to a chair at the kitchen table. His face had gone the color of ash, and his lips had a blue tint to them, and the gash on his arm was ugly and deep and still leaking through the torn leather. Eula went to the closet and came back with her sewing basket and a metal first aid tin Walt had kept in his truck years ago, and she sat down across from the kid and took his arm in her two hands, gentle as you please, and rolled the sleeve back. He hissed through his teeth. "Hold still, honey," she said. "I've sewn up worse than you." And she had. A seamstress' hands are steady hands, and Eula's had closed 1,000 seams that had no business being closed. She cleaned the wound out with peroxide from the tin and didn't rush and didn't apologize when it stung. She couldn't stitch skin, she said so plainly, but she could hold it shut. She butterflied it closed with strips she cut from clean cloth, then wound a bandage over it neat and firm, the way you'd bind anything you meant to hold. When she was done, she patted the back of his hand. "That'll keep till a real doctor sees it," she said. "You're going to have a scar to brag about." Then she got up and went at the next problem, which was food. She had a pot of bean soup on the back of the stove, made that afternoon, meant to be her supper that night and her dinner the next day. Enough for one small woman, twice. She looked at the pot, and she looked at the 4 big men in her front room, and you could see her doing the arithmetic. Then she added water. She opened her last can of tomatoes and a can of hominy, and stirred them in and cut up the half an onion she had left, and she put the flame up high, and she found the end of a loaf of bread and a jar of chow-chow she'd put up in the summer. She fed all 4 of them first, bowls of soup, bread torn into pieces, the chow-chow on the side. She did not fix a bowl for herself. When Marcus noticed and asked her, she said she'd eaten big at midday. She hadn't. She hadn't eaten since morning. Then the cold. They were soaked through and shaking down to the bone. Dell's teeth were chattering loud enough to hear across the room. Eula went through the house and pulled every warm thing out of it. The quilts off both beds, a wool blanket out of the hall closet, a crocheted Afghan her own mother had made before Eula was born. And then she went to the couch and picked up Walt's green coat, the one she'd laid out that afternoon for no reason she could name. She carried it to Marcus because he was the biggest and he was standing by the wall where there was no room for him to sit. "Put this on," she said. "It was my husband's. He was a big man, too." Marcus looked at the coat and then at her, and something moved across his face that a man like him did not show to strangers. He put it on. It fit him almost like it had been cut for him. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. Then Eula turned to Dell, whose boots were off and whose feet had gone bone white. Early frostbite. She got down on her knees on the cold kitchen floor, a 74-year-old woman with a bad hip, and she took that man's feet between her 2 hands and rubbed them slow and hard to bring the blood back. Dell stared at the top of her head and didn't say a word, and his eyes went red at the edges. When the color started to come back into his toes, she pulled her own thick wool socks off her feet and put them on his. "Those are my Sunday socks," she said. "You better not run off with them." Dell laughed. It came out rough, like it had to break through something to get out. It was the first time any of them had laughed in hours. While all this was going on, Marcus was watching. He didn't say much. He mostly just took the room in. He saw the pot and the bucket in the corner, under the brown stain on the ceiling, where the roof let go. He saw the blanket nailed over the back doorway to hold the heat in the front of the house. He saw the plastic taped over one cracked window pane, peeling at the corner where she kept pressing it back down. He saw there was no furnace running anywhere, just the little coal stove doing the whole job. And he saw the photographs. Eula and Walt on their wedding day, both of them thin and young and laughing at something outside the frame. A whole church group on some picnic long ago. A cracked cabinet in the corner with a spool of thread and a thimble worn thin from 50 years of use. He saw something else too, though it didn't register with him right then. On the wall by the door hung an old calendar, and behind it, wedged into the frame to keep it from sliding, was a folded magazine, gone soft and yellow with age. He couldn't read the cover from where he stood. He didn't think anything of it. Eula hung the men's wet vests near the stove to dry. As she draped the biggest one over a chair, she saw the death's head on the back, the one everybody knew, and below it a smaller patch she didn't recognize, a little red hawk with its wings spread inside a ring. She didn't ask about it. She just turned it toward the heat. The men warmed up and started to talk, the way people do when they've come in out of dying. Toby told her about his mother back in Ohio, how he called her every Sunday, and she still worried about him, like he was 10. Dell showed her a picture on his phone of his granddaughter, a little thing with pigtails and no front teeth. Roscoe didn't say much, but when Eula asked about the small hawk patch on the vest, it was Marcus who looked up and got quiet. And then he told her that Hank had designed it. Hank was the brother they were riding for. He drew it himself, years back, before he passed. They all wore it now. Eula listened to every word like it was the most important thing she'd heard all week, because to her, it was. She was the kind of person who could make a man feel like whatever he said had weight to it. Marcus watched her do it, and something in his chest that had been shut for a long while came loose. He told her, quiet, that he'd buried people, that he understood what it was to keep going after you lose the person who made the world make sense. Eula looked at Walt's photograph over the stove, and then she looked at Marcus, and neither of them said anything, and both of them understood the other completely. By 1 in the morning, the men were asleep. 4 grown men folded up on her couch, and her floor and her husband's chair, wrapped in quilts and afghans, breathing slow. Eula did not sleep. She sat up at the kitchen table and kept the stove fed and kept the oil lamp burning and made sure the house held its heat, watching over 4 strangers like they were her own blood come home. Around 3 in the morning, she got up quiet so she wouldn't wake them. She took the last of her flour and the last of her lard and what buttermilk was left, and on that little stove, by lamplight, in the middle of a blizzard, she made a pan of biscuits. She set them under a clean towel on the counter for morning. Then she sat back down in the lamplight, and she waited for the sun. I have to stop right here a second, because I keep coming back to it. This woman gave away her supper, her blankets, her husband's coat, the socks off her own feet. And then, at 3 in the morning, she got up and baked biscuits for 4 men she'd never met before that night, on the last flour she had in the house. I don't know that I could do that. I'd like to think I could. I'm honestly not sure. When the sun came up, the storm had blown itself out. The wind quit. 2 feet of snow lay over Corliss, and the sky went clear and hard and blue for the first time in a day. The men woke one at a time, stiff and sore, blinking in the light. And then they smelled coffee, because Eula was down to her last handful of grounds, and she'd made a pot of it. And they smelled the biscuits warming, and they came to that little kitchen table like men who hadn't been sure they'd see morning, because a few hours before, they hadn't been. 4 enormous bikers crowded around a table built for 2, elbows knocking, knees against the wall, eating biscuits with the last of Eula's blackberry jam like it was the finest meal they'd ever had. And right then, it was. Toby ate 3. Del shut his eyes on the first bite. Roscoe shook his head slow and just said, Lord. Eula stood by the stove with her own cup and watched them eat. And she had a small smile on her face, because keeping 4 men alive through a night like that was the only pay she'd ever wanted. When they finished, Marcus pushed his chair back. He reached inside the vest, dry now, and pulled out a fold of bills, more cash than Eula had held in her hand in years, and he set it on the table in front of her. Ma'am, this is for everything you did. Please, take it. Eula looked at the money. She did not touch it. She slid it back across the table, slow and steady, no heat in it at all. Put that away, she said. I didn't open my door for money. I opened it because you needed in. That's the whole of it. The room went still. Marcus stared at her. His eyes went bright for just a second, and he blinked it down, because he was not a man who let anyone see that. He nodded once and put the money back in his vest. Then he did something the others didn't expect. He took a small leather book out of his inside pocket, a good one, dark and worn smooth, and a pen, and he asked her name. Eula Grant. He wrote it down careful. He asked her address. She laughed at him and told him he didn't owe her a thing in this world. He said it was only in case he wanted to send a proper thank you. So she told him, and he wrote it down, and he closed the book and put it away. Before they left, the men worked. 2 of them cleared the 2 feet of snow off her steps, and her walk without being asked. Del found a bag of stove ash by the cellar door and threw it down for grip. Roscoe looked at the soft board on the top step, the one that had put her on the ground in October, and he pulled it and turned it and screwed it back solid with a driver from his kit, and he didn't say a word about it. He just fixed it. Toby was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway with his bandaged arm, and he took Eula's hand in both of his. You're like my grandma was, he said, and his voice came apart on the last word. Eula reached up and patted his cheek. "You call your mother when you're home safe," she said. "You hear me?" He couldn't answer. He nodded and went out. She stood in the doorway and watched the four of them walk off through all the white, getting smaller and smaller until the road bent and took them out of sight. Then she went back in, sat down at her table, and finished her coffee alone in the quiet. For a couple of weeks, nothing came of it, and Eula figured that was the end of the story. She figured wrong. Life went back to its usual shape. The pipes had held. The roof still leaked, and the bucket went back to the spare room. She told the Delgado kids about the bikers over their after-school cornbread, and their eyes got round as saucers. 4 great big men asleep on her floor, she said. And Walt would have had a fit. The kids asked if she'd been scared. She thought about it. No, she said. They were just cold. That was all it was. A good story for the kitchen table. Then the strange things started. First, a truck from the fuel company came up Chestnut Row and filled her coal bin clear to the top. And when she went out to say they had the wrong house, the driver checked his sheet and said, "No, ma'am, this one's paid, ordered by phone, no name left." She let it go and figured it was somebody from the old church being kind. A week after that, a different truck, a crew of 2 men, cold weather gear, clipboard. They knocked and told her they'd been sent to look at her roof, no charge, a courtesy call. Eula stood in the door with her arms folded and asked sent by who. The foreman flipped a page and ran his finger down it. "Job's under a company," he said. Red Hawk Building Supply. Eula had never heard of it. She was ready to send them off, but the roof had been failing for 2 years, and the man said it wouldn't cost her a thing to let them look, so she let them up. They took pictures and measured and made notes and thanked her and left. That night she mentioned it over the fence to Ruth. "Red Hawk Building Supply," Ruth said. "That's one of those big hardware chains. They've got stores all over the country." Eula waved it off. "Some kind of mix-up," she said, but it sat with her. Later, she couldn't tell you why, she went and pulled the old magazine out from behind the calendar on the wall, the one she'd wedged in there years ago to keep it from sliding. She unfolded it and looked at the cover for the first time in a long time. It was a business magazine, one Walt had brought home from the barbershop the year before he passed, because he liked to read about men who built things. Across the top, it said something about the country's self-made billionaires. There was a row of small photographs of faces along the bottom, men in suits she'd never known and never would. She looked at it a while. Something at the very back of her mind moved, and then went quiet before she could catch it. She shook her head, folded the magazine, and slid it right back behind the calendar to keep it from sliding, the way it had done its job for years. Then, on a Tuesday morning about 3 weeks after the storm, a long black car came up Chestnut Row, and everything Eula thought she understood about the night turned over. It was a little after 10. She was at the sink with her hands in the dishwater when she heard the engine, low and smooth, not a sound that belonged on her street. She looked out. A black SUV with dark glass sat at her curb, new, the chrome on it throwing the morning sun. Ruth came out onto her porch to look. The baker's curtain moved. A car like that on Chestnut Row meant something, and it was usually bad. 2 men in dark coats stepped out and stood by the car with their hands folded. Then the front door opened and a man got out. Tall, broad, clean-shaven now, gray hair cut close, a good charcoal overcoat, and shined shoes. Eula didn't know him. He looked like he'd stepped off the cover of a magazine, and, in a way, he had. He came up her walk and climbed the same steps he'd climbed 3 weeks before, half frozen. Only this time, his shoes were dry and his back was straight, and he knocked, 2 knocks, soft. She opened the door and looked at him. She looked at the car and the 2 men by it and back at his face, and then it caught. The eyes. She knew the eyes. "Well, I'll be," she said slowly. "It's you, the one with my husband's coat." Marcus smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He stood in her doorway and told her, plain, who he actually was. His name was Marcus Reyes, 58 years old. He had started a building supply business out of the back of a pickup truck when he was 30, selling salvage lumber and used tools to men who couldn't afford new. He grew it 1 store at a time. Now it was called Red Hawk Building Supply. It had better than 900 stores across the country and something close to 40,000 people working for it. And last anybody counted, it was worth a little over $3 billion. Marcus Reyes was one of the wealthiest men in the state, And 3 weeks before, he'd been dying of cold on Eula Grant's porch. Eula put her hand on the doorframe to steady herself. She looked at the SUV, at the men in coats, back at Marcus. "You're telling me," she said, "you're some kind of a rich man." "On paper," he said. There was no shine to how he said it. "But that night I was just a man who was freezing to death, and you saved my life, all 4 of us." She stood there and let it settle, and the pieces started to slide into place. The men riding through, no cars, no drivers, just leather and the mountain road, because that was Hank's ride, and it wasn't the kind of thing you brought money to. The little red hawk on the vest, the one Hank had drawn, that was the same hawk on the sign of every one of those 900 stores, and she'd hung it by her stove to dry and never made the connection. The good leather book he'd written her name in was his own. The magazine behind her calendar, the one about self-made men that she'd used for years to keep the calendar from sliding down the wall, his face was one of the small ones along the bottom. She started to laugh. Not a polite little laugh, a real one, the kind that shakes a body. "I've been using your face to hold my calendar up on the wall," she said. Marcus laughed too, hard, and the 2 men by the car looked at each other, lost. The last of the strangeness broke right there. Then he got serious. He asked to come in, and he sat down at her kitchen table, in the same chair where he'd eaten her biscuits. And he looked around the room again, at the bucket, at the blanket over the doorway, at the little stove doing a furnace's whole job. Then he looked at her. "Mrs. Grant," he said, "I've sat across the table from men who had everything a person could want, and most of them would have left me on that porch. You had every reason to. Every one. And you didn't just crack the door. You gave us the coat off your husband's back and the socks off your own feet." His voice was even, but his eyes weren't. "I've thought about that night every day since, and I want to do something, not to pay you. You already told me what you think of paying. Think of it as putting money where it does some good for once." Eula folded her hands in her lap. "I'm listening," she said. "I didn't say yes to anything, but I'm listening." What Marcus laid out for her that morning was not really about Eula at all. That was the thing about it. It spread out past her, all down Chestnut Row and clear across Corliss. He started with the house because that was the easy part. Red Hawk was going to fix it. New roof, new furnace, the wiring brought up to code, the pipes, the windows, the porch steps. And he told her before she could open her mouth that they were not going to lay a hand on the back porch. Walt built it crooked, and it was going to stay crooked. Floor sloping toward the yard and all, because that was where Walt's hands had been, and Marcus understood that a man's hands are worth keeping. That was when Eula's eyes filled, though she pressed her lips together and didn't let it go further. Then the back taxes and the medical bills, the whole drawer she never opened, gone, cleared, and a small fund set up, so that a woman who'd worked her whole life would never again lie awake over a light bill. But he wasn't done. And this next part was the part that made her go still. He'd noticed something about her that night, he said, and he hadn't been able to shake it. She mended things. She took broken things and torn things and worn out things, and she made them whole and handed them back. And she did it for nothing, for the pure sake of it. Coats and pants and children and, if he was honest, 4 half-dead men. Down on the main street, he said, there was an empty building. Used to be the old 5 and Dime, boarded up 11 years, weeds coming through the sidewalk out front. Red Hawk was going to gut it and rebuild it into a place with big work tables and sewing machines and shelves. A workshop where the people of Corliss could bring what was broken and get it mended, and learn to mend it themselves, and where every child in that town could get a warm coat that fit before winter. There'd be a kitchen in the back, too, because Eula was going to insist on feeding people whether he built her a kitchen or not, so he might as well build a good one. Paid staff, 5 to start, all hired right there in Corliss. Red Hawk would carry the whole cost for the first several years, and after that, it would stand on its own with the town behind it, and she was going to run it. Eula's mouth came open, and nothing came out. Then the street itself. The county had forgotten Chestnut Row, and half of Corliss along with it. The sidewalks were broken, there were no lights on the dark end, the kids played in the road because there was nowhere else. Red Hawk's foundation was putting money into all of it, new walks, new lights, and a small park on the empty lot at the end of the block, with the say-so, on how to spend it going to a board of people who actually lived there. He wanted Eula to sit at the head of it. And there was one last thing, and he set his pen down for this one, because it was the part that mattered most to him. Red Hawk was going to put 2 young people from Corliss through college every single year. Kids who gave their time to their neighbors the way Eula had given hers to everyone. And the scholarships were going to carry 2 names, Walter and Eula Grant. That was when Eula broke, not the way people break in the pictures. She didn't cry out or come apart. She went very, very still, and then the tears came down slow and quiet, one after another, from some place so deep she hadn't known it was down there. All those years of holding it together, every bill and every leak and every cold night and every empty chair across the table, carried alone for 9 years and never once sat down, and somebody had finally seen her. The room was quiet, except for the stove. Marcus didn't say anything. He just gave her the room to feel it. After a while, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and got her breath. "You're telling me," she said, "the young ones on this street are going to have somewhere to play." "Yes, ma'am." "And somebody's going to help them get to college." "Yes, ma'am." "Because I made a pot of soup stretch." Marcus leaned forward. "Because you opened the door, Mrs. Grant, when nobody else on this whole street would." She looked at Walt's photograph over the stove for a long moment, the way you look at somebody when you're asking them something. Then she looked back at Marcus. "Can I put Walt's name on the workshop too? Not just the scholarship?" "You can put his name on every board in it," Marcus said. She reached across the table, and her small hand disappeared into his, and they shook on it. "Then we've got a deal," she said. And for the first time all morning, Eula Grant smiled, the kind of smile that changes the whole shape of a face. Now, this is the part where you'd think the story wraps up. It doesn't. It spreads. The crews came that spring, trucks and scaffolding and men in hard hats going up Eula's rotted steps with new lumber. The old roof came off, the one held together with tar and prayer, and a new one went on. A furnace went into the cellar, and the first time Eula turned a dial on the wall and felt warm air come up out of the floor, she stood over that vent with her eyes closed for a full 5 minutes and didn't move. Real windows went in where the plastic had been, and the crooked back porch stayed exactly where Walt left it. Eula sat out on it the morning the work was done, coffee in hand, no coat needed even out there yet, biscuit at her feet, and she looked out over the street and said, real quiet, "We got a new roof, Walt." That fall, the workshop opened. The old 5 and dime, boarded up 11 years, was gone, and in its place was a bright room full of light, with long tables and machines and shelves of good wool coats sorted by size, and a warm kitchen in the back. Over the door hung a plain hand-painted sign, the Walter and Eula Grant Mending House. Eula was there at 6 in the morning, on opening day, in an apron somebody had made her that said head seamstress, though she told everyone she was really just there to keep the coffee going. People came. Mothers who'd been safety pinning their kids' coats shut, brought them in, and left with them mended and warm. Old men who hadn't sat at a table with company in months came for the soup and stayed for the talk. Teenagers drifted in after school because it was warm, and somebody actually asked how their day went. A woman from Corliss who'd never in her life owned a coat that fit walked out in one that did, and she cried on the sidewalk, and Eula stood in the door and let her. Down at the end of Chestnut Row, the empty lot became a little park with a swing set and a slide and soft ground so nobody skinned a knee. The Delgado kids were the first ones on it. New lights went up on the dark end of the street, and the broken walks got poured smooth. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Corliss looked like a place a person might want to stay. Come spring, the first 2 scholarships went out at the high school. One to a girl who wanted to be a nurse and would be the first in her family to go to college. One to a quiet boy who wanted to study to build roads and bridges and come back and build them in the towns like Corliss. Eula handed them out herself, standing at the podium with her hands shaking just a little, and she told those 2 kids the only thing she wanted them to remember. "Your job isn't to pay this back," she said. "Your job is to hand it on down the line." The room was silent, and then it wasn't. The writers came back too, Marcus and Roscoe and Dell and Toby, colors on, rolling into Corliss on a clear Saturday for the opening weekend. They sat at a long table in the mending house and ate Eula's soup, the same recipe from the night, and Toby took a spoonful and grinned and said it was still better than his mother's. Dell brought his granddaughter, the little one with the pigtails. And Eula held that child on her lap like she'd known her since the day she was born. And here's where I want to leave you, because this is the part that got me. 1 year to the weekend after that storm, the club made Hanks ride again, the long way through the mountains, the way they always would. But this year they ended it in Corliss, and this year they weren't alone. Word had gotten around, the way these things do, and the whole town came out. They lined both sides of the main street in the cold, kids on shoulders, old men in doorways, breath fogging in the air, and when the bikes came down off the mountain and rolled up toward the mending house, the people of Corliss clapped for 4 men, who a year before couldn't get a single door on Chestnut Row to open. At the end of that day, before they left, Toby came and found Eula. He had a small package in his hands, wrapped plain. Inside was a leather vest, her size, and on the back, under nothing else, just the little red hawk that Hank had drawn. The chapter had voted, he said. They wanted her to have it. Not a member exactly, Marcus told her. They had rules about that. But as close to family as the club had ever let anyone come who didn't ride. Toby was crying and not trying to hide it. My grandma passed when I was 15, he said. I told you that night you were like her. I'd take it as an honor if you'd let me call you Gram. Eula reached up and held that big kid's face in her 2 small hands, the same hands that had closed his arm on the worst night of his life. Sit down and eat then, she said. Gram's got soup on. She wore that vest to the mending house every single day after. Over her apron, the death's head nowhere on it, just Hank's red hawk on her back. And every year on the weekend closest to that storm, when the bikes came down off the mountain, Eula Grant was standing out front waiting, an old woman in an apron and a biker's vest, with the door already open and the coffee already on. Because that was always the whole of it with Eula. You take what you've been given, and while you're getting by on it, you leave the door open for whoever comes up the steps out of the cold. I keep thinking about it. She had nothing. Back taxes in a drawer she was scared to open. A roof full of holes, socks with the heels worn through. And she still gave 4 strangers every last thing she had, and never once thought it made her a saint. She thought it made her a neighbor. If that doesn't do something to you, I don't know what will. If this one got to you the way it got to me, do me a favor and hit that like button, and share it with somebody who needs the reminder tonight that people like Eula are still out there. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Because these stories are all around us. Most of the time, we just don't knock.